Okay, this lesson is on airspace. This lesson's on airspace, and definitely want to take a little time with airspace and just kind of really start off by saying airspace. All airspace in the United States is what we call regulated. Okay, doesn't mean that it's controlled. There's a difference there, and we'll talk a little bit more what that means in a minute. But all airspace is regulated in some way or another. If you launch a manned aircraft into the air, you are in some sort of regulated airspace, even if it's not has to have a control tower or whatever. So I just want to start off by saying that. So make sure you have your notes sheet ready to go. Anything I don't get to in this video will clear up in class, but I just want to make sure you have these notes. There's a lot of notes to take in this, so make sure you got a good pencil, you got your sheet, and you're ready to rock. So here we go. So airspace. FAA rules apply to the National Airspace System. We call that the NOS, and there's no such thing as unregulated airspace. So types of airspace. Let's start with Class A. And this is not for VFR. This is only for IFR traffic. And so you must be IFR certified. Both the aircraft and the person flying the aircraft need to be IFR rated or certified. And the dimensions are at or above 18,000 feet MSL. So anytime you're at or above 18,000 feet MSL and below 60,000 MSL, it's like a block, there is a cap to it, you're in Class A airspace. Now, since you're flying instruments, there is no visibility or cloud clearance requirements. And it's not shown on maps because everybody just knows that it's above 18,000 feet. All right. Now we have Class B airspace. So Class B, you must be cleared into that airspace. Okay. So Class B is around busier airports in the country, and you must be cleared into that airspace. You can't be a student pilot. You cannot be a student pilot in Class B without a special endorsement in your logbook saying that you've received and logged flight training in that airspace and also at the airport within that airspace. So you have to have actually two different endorsements to land in it. You can fly through it with one endorsement, but you can't land there without that second endorsement. And you do have to have some equipment. You do have to have what's called a Mode C transponder. We haven't talked about transponders. Maybe we have, maybe we haven't. It just depends on the order of the class. But a transponder is basically a piece of radar equipment that's in your plane that can be interrogated by radar, and then it sends back a number. So we'll talk more about that in class. So the typical dimensions are surface to 10,000 feet MSL. But right away I can tell you that we have 12,000 foot ones right here in Utah. So that's kind of taken with a grain of salt. But it's up to about 10 or 12,000 feet MSL depending on the area. And it can be very odd shaped depending on the needs of the airspace. Visibility, you have to have at least 3 miles visibility to operate within Class B airspace under VFR, and you must remain clear of clouds. Now, that doesn't mean the airspace needs to be clear of clouds. You just need to stay clear of clouds. And if you look at a map, it's going to be solid dark blue lines on a map. It's going to look like this. Now, these have been enhanced. They won't quite be this dark and heavy, but that will give you the general idea. And we'll talk more about that in class. Might look more like this there. Then we have Class C airspace. Now, currently, as of this recording, there is no Class C airspace in the state of Utah, where we are. It's kind of like a simpler Class B airspace. You do have to have two-way radio communication required. Now, just to sum that up very quickly, that means you must call them, and they must respond with your tail number. That is the only way to have it resolved. So let's say, for example, your tail number is November 130 Hotel Bravo. So 130 Hotel Bravo, that's the number on your tail of your plane. Well, you might call up like a tower. You may call up and say like Boise Tower, Cessna 130 Hotel Bravo, 30 miles to the west, looking to land in Boise. And if they come back and say 130 Hotel Bravo, you're cleared in. That's it, you're done. Versus Class B, where you have to have a specific clearance to get into there. You also have to have that Mode C transponder in order to get in and out of that airspace. The dimensions are surface area is a 5 nautical mile radius up to 4,000 feet AGL. The outer circle with a 10 nautical mile radius that extends up from 1,200 feet to 1,400 feet above the airport elevation. We'll talk more about that later on. Then we have visibility and cloud clearance. 3 statute miles, so 3 miles. And then we start with the first airspace on our list that has this, what we call the 152 rule. Now, the Cessna 152 was a very famous little training airplane. It's been around forever. And it's not really 152, but it is 1,000 feet above clouds. So if this is your cloud, you have to be 1,000 feet above it or more, minimum 500 feet below it or more, and 2,000 feet horizontally from that cloud or more. And since that's 1, 5, and 2, those of us who have flown the little Cessna 170 or 152, we remember that as the 152 rule. Okay, 3 statute miles, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontally. And the symbology is going to be solid magenta lines, like these here that you see around this airport. This is Daytona Beach. And right here it says 4,000 feet MSL to the surface inside this ring. And then this outer ring is 1,200 feet to 4,000 feet. And then we have Class D airspace. Two-way radio communications is required. Notice it doesn't say Mode C transponder. It's not required. A lot of Class D airports don't have radar. Then we have dimensions, 4 nautical mile radius, and it only goes up to 2,500 feet AGL. This is a much simpler one. It's just like a little cylinder of airspace sitting around an airport, and goes up to 2,500 feet AGL. 3 statute miles, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontally. That's how far you got to stay away from clouds and the minimum visibility requirements. And the symbology, dashed dark blue lines. So something like this would be Class D, not this little box coming off. That's actually Class E to the surface. This is Class D, and this goes up to 2,700 feet MSL because it has this 2.7 right here. And then we have Class C. This is where it gets complicated, so give yourself some room to write all this down. First of all, there's no clearance required in Class E. You can fly in and out of there all you want. There's no radio requirements. There's no transponder requirements. The altitude will be depicted on the chart for Class E. It extends up to, but not including, 1,800 feet MSL. And all airspace above flight level 600 is Class C airspace. I mentioned that earlier. I forgot to explain it. When you get to 18,000 feet, we stop saying 18,000 feet, 19,000 feet, 25,000 feet, and we start saying flight level. And like this is flight level 600. That means it's 60,000 feet. You add 2 zeros to it, and that's the number. We call them flight levels up there. And there's a reason for it. It's pretty technical. We can talk about it in class if you want to. Now here's where it gets complicated. The visibility and cloud clearance requirements. So at or above 10,000 feet MSL. So if you're at or above 10,000 feet, you have to have 5 miles visibility. You have to stay 1,000 feet above and below, and 1 statute mile horizontally from the cloud. If you're below 10,000 feet MSL, you have the 3-152 rule. And the reason why that is because when you're up high in the sky above 10,000, there's different speed requirements for aircraft, and they want you to be able to see further above 10,000 feet. Now, you may have faded magenta lines when it starts at 700 feet AGL, or you may have dashed magenta lines on a sectional chart. So like this is a faded magenta line. It fades into the airspace. So that means that the airspace starts at 700 feet AGL and goes up to, well, when it hits something else. This one is D. We already talked about D, but this one, little box over here, that's Class E to the surface. It's a dashed magenta line. All right, then we have Class G. G is kind of everywhere. So we're not going to have any visibility and cloud requirements yet. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. So, but let's start with entry requirements. There are none. Dimensions, well, it's the surface to the base of the overlying airspace, so like Class E. So, for example, in this one, there's Class E inside this circle, but there's G right below that bumps up into it. There's G right below that. Symbology, well, none, because it's where the airspace isn't. It's sort of like as a filler. It fills in everything else. Now, Class G for visibility has some pretty complex requirements. So let's get with those. All right, here we go. If you're at or below 1,200 feet AGL, so 1,200 feet below the ground, above the ground or below, 1 statute mile clear of clouds during the daytime. At night, it's same spot, 3 statute miles in the 152 rule. 1,000 above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontally. Now, if you're more than 1,200 feet AGL and you're in Class G airspace, but below 10,000 feet MSL, so 1 statute mile visibility, and then a 152 rule. 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. If it's at nighttime, 3 statute miles, 152 rule. So nighttime is pretty much the same for both. Doesn't matter where you are. But then we get above 10,000 feet, and then we get 5 miles, 1,000 feet above, 1 statute mile horizontally from clouds. At or above 12,000 feet, but above 1,200 AGL. So I'll explain why that's such a peculiar way to think about altitude. Well, like what airports could be at 11,000 feet, but anyway, 1,200 AGL. Well, there are places like if you're flying around the Rocky Mountains and stuff. And then at night, 5 miles, 1,000 feet above, below, 1 statute mile horizontally. So this is the same as Class E. This is the 152 rule, and then this is a weird one right here. This is a weird one here, and this is kind of a weird one here. So memorize this graph. Make sure you write that down. Make sure you write that down. Now we're going to get into some simpler things. First of all, VFR requirements for pilots. VFR requirements for pilots. So let's see here. General aviation pilots must operate under VFR or IFR. VFR stands for Visual Flight Rules. IFR stands for Instrument Flight Rules. IFR requires special certification. Okay. This is just kind of a review of what we just said. Okay. All right, so that's just kind of a review of what we said, visibility and cloud clearance. Watch this video there. All right, so let's get in now into some special use airspace. Let's start with prohibited areas. Prohibited means you can't go there, and that means all flights are prohibited. Example, the White House or the U.S. Capitol building. The symbology typically is blue lines with smaller lines radiating inward, like this. Then we have restricted areas. These usually have some sort of invisible hazard, like artillery firing, guided missiles, things like that. You have to have clearance from the controlling agency. It's very dangerous to fly in without authorization. So it's restricted. That means sometimes you can go in, sometimes you can't. It's restricted. That's not prohibited. Those mean different things. And it looks like this. Blue lines radiating inward. It says the word restricted inside of it. Then we have these things called warning areas. These are the same as restricted areas, but they're located in international airspace. They're usually located over water, and the symbology is blue lines with smaller lines radiating inward. Like this. All right, then we have alert areas. This just usually has something going on that they just want to draw your attention to on the chart. So you're traversing the area. Let's say you're flying from Georgia down to the Florida Keys, and you're going through this part of Florida here, and you see this alert area here. It says concentrated flight train. That's just telling you that if you're passing through here, you might want to beware. There's going to be a lot of traffic there. Maybe go around it, maybe try to go above it, but either way, you should be alert to that. So make sure you write these notes down. All right, then we have MOAs. Now, you don't actually have to have permission to fly into a MOA or an alert area. Pretty much anything that's magenta like this, you don't have to have permission to fly into. So it's meant to separate military traffic from IFR traffic. You need to exercise extreme caution in those areas. No clearance is needed. And you can see the active tides on the sectional map. So when we get to class and I have a sectional, I'll show that to you. Then we have MTRs. These are usually below 10,000. They're military training routes, and they have very high-speed military aircraft training on them. And sometimes they're instrument flight only. So, like, this is a VFR one. See this light gray line here? VFR, IFR, things like that. All right. So one thing you should know about national park areas, this is from my drone class, so they just define it here, but pilots should try to avoid flight within 2,000 feet AGL above those areas. They really don't want you doing that. I've never heard anybody being busted for it or whatever. It's just strongly recommended by the FAA to avoid flying within 2,000 feet above that. You can get fined as a nuisance or trespassing or some other things. You won't. It's not exactly illegal, but they could get you on some other things as well. So we want to make sure we understand that. So things like this kind of dotted line around here, that's going to be a wilderness area or some sort of national park. And then we have TFRs. I've got a great story to tell you about TFRs. I'll be sure to tell you that in class. But when necessary to protect persons and property on the ground, sometimes they throw up a TFR. And they won't be on your sectional charts, but they might be on something like Sky Vector, and they'll give you a little circle. They'll have it there. Usually you can look up TFRs in terms of NOTAMs online. You can look up NOTAMs along a route. You can call up a flight briefer and get it that way as well. But basically you are prevented from going in there. It's restricted to certain aircraft. It might be firefighting going on. It might be, like in this case, this was some sort of a playoff game between the Dodgers and the Giants or something like that. So there you go, yeah. All right, this next part, there's really not much in your notes, but you should know special VFR. So special VFR is when you want to operate in things that are less than VFR, but less than basic VFR, which is 3 miles, statute in miles. So let's take a look at this real quick. I was hoping to find an example, but I really don't have a good one here. So only within the lateral boundaries of B, C, D, and E. So you have to be in these 4, okay, below 10,000 feet MSL, and only requested by the pilot. And on the basis of weather conditions reported at the airport, you have to be a private pilot or higher. And in Class B, 1 mile visibility in clear clouds. At night, you must be instrument rated to request it. Now, you might flip over your notes and just kind of write those on the back. I didn't include them in your notes, but it's worth noting. It's worth noting what special VFR is. All right. Now, there is maybe some other stuff in your notes. We'll fill that in when we get there. But those are the basics of what you need to know for airspace. That's the basics. That's just the beginning. You'll need to learn a lot more about it as you fly around in it. But it's kind of one of those things until you really operate in it and learn about how ATC works, or in some cases doesn't work, how traffic patterns in the airport works. It's just sort of one more thing you kind of need to know. Like, what are the rules for the airspace I'm operating in here, along my route, and where I'm landing? And the more you fly, the more you'll learn this stuff. But this is a pretty decent introduction to it.